Thank you, Dee, and good afternoon, everybody. So what we're going to do today may be a little different than some other REMI guest webinars that you've seen. It's going to kind of straddle the territory between what REMI tends to do with its internal staff webinars, which tend to be more software focused and model training focused, and ones that are done by outsiders, where those are consultants, academics, people who work in state, federal, local government, in the sense that we're going to talk about how energy is distributed throughout the REMI model structure and how you do policy analysis around it. And then we're going to actually look into the software a little bit. There's not going to be a ton of discussion necessarily about the interface, but at least there's going to be more of a discussion about kind of the model structure and the theory and practice of how different types of energy inputs go into the model and influence its results. For some of you who've spent a lot of time either in REMI just by itself, hopefully it'll be something for you to learn on the energy side about how it interacts with the model. And for those of you who spend a lot of time with energy economics, whether you're a consultant or you work for a utility or regulatory commission or something, hopefully there'll be something interesting for you on that side, looking from the other direction about how REMI is influenced by the energy sector. So with that, I'll get going on to this. There's one disclaimer slide. There really isn't any analytical results in here, so this isn't absolutely necessary. And then there's a couple slides that are just overviews to FTI that I'm just going to skip over. They're not really interesting to anybody, with one exception, this being this last one here. We have a power sector model. It's the blue box there called Plexos. Plexos is a kind of a big linear program that you put your own data into, and you can do different types of modeling with it. You could theoretically do all sorts of systems analysis. You could do travel demand modeling with Plexos. We use it for utility and energy economics, however. So if you hear the phrase Plexos throughout this presentation, as opposed to a more general term for a utility planning or a capacity expansion model that represents power plants and transmission lines, maybe gas pipelines, maybe coal routes, rail and barge and the like. If you hear Plexos, that's what I'm talking about, a model that handles the supply side of what the energy sector looks like and how it interacts with a macro model like REMI. There are others out there that do similar things. Aurora, I think, merged with Plexos, but I think the product still exists. There's an NREL model called REEDS. The DOE NEMS model does a similar idea at a more a broader energy market level, but less detail in the power sector. There's a couple others like that. So any one of those types of models, what I'm going to say here about REMI is going to be applicable to them. Plexos is just the one that we use. So as a consequence, if you hear that, that's what it means. So real quick, we'll just get into what we're doing here. The first thing I'm going to do is talk through the REMI model structure. A lot of you have probably seen this, whether it was REMI pitching you on the software, or you have been exposed to it during their training exercises, or you happen to stumble across it in the software, all of which are possible and interesting. But I like to do my own introduction to what block 1, 2, 3, 4, not so much 5 mean, and then I'll start shading the conversation towards what the interesting energy topics are on top of this. So first of all, output and demand at the top of the model. Output and demand is the macro economy. It's aggregate supply or aggregate demand if you're speaking in Keynesian terms. If you look at the center there, it's highlighted, it's got all the blue and yellow arrows around it, output. The things that are feeding into it, the yellow lines, state and local government, investment, intermediate inputs, exports, probably should say net exports actually, consumption, are all the components of GDP. So we've got the standard C for consumption, plus I for investment, plus G for government spending, plus exports, X minus M, so net exports included in that. So on top is what an economy needs to produce or wants to produce, given the current preferences of consumers, given the current needs of industry, and given what the current public policy looks like, both on the spending and regulatory side. This can change when you do energy analysis, and it can change in a few different ways. The most important ones are the consumption side, because if you were to do something that was to change either consumer preferences towards what they are buying in terms of energy products, so maybe going from a fuel product or a gas product to electricity, so electrifying, consumption would be where that kind of effect would be implemented in the model. Investment and government spending are also important because a lot of the energy market has very, 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 very large capital expenditures associated with it on the tunes of billions and tens of billions of dollars. Building a new gas plant or hypothetical a new nuclear plant at some point, or a big transmission line or a pipeline, just those big facilities that actually manage and produce and distribute energy in all its forms throughout the economy. Those require really, really large capital investments. So that investment effect is also present when you're looking at the energy sector. So there are demand side changes related to energy, and they're going to be reflected in block 1 at the top that we talked about a second ago. Block 2, just below that, labor and capital demand. This is the firm, and by firm I mean just any business. This could be a partnership, this could be an S-corp, this could be a sole proprietor, this could be a corporation, this could be a nonprofit, this could be a government agency for that matter. So any production side of the economy, any sector in the 2370 or 160 sector REMI combinations can be in block 2. And all of those different entities. So I talked about the legal form of organization, but we could talk about it in the way the model actually organizes it, which is around sectoral. So ag, natural resources, construction, utilities, manufacturing, wholesale, retail, various types of services, and then public sector, so government. All those demand labor and demand capital. A lot of people, of course, understand that businesses are dealing in markets and they're selling products, whether those are goods or services, to customers, whether those customers are individual households or consumers or other businesses. But most people don't as strongly internalize, this audience with economists probably, but the general public, that they actually are participating in markets as sellers when they sell their labor. So this is looking at the perspective not of the labor sellers, the workers, but the labor buyers, the proprietors, the managers, et cetera, that occupy those sectors and those legal organizations I talked through a second ago. So if we look at what's going on inside of here, the model calculates employment demand based on productivity. So the number of workers required is a function of how many workers are needed to do a certain amount of work, and this does change over time. Labor productivity continues to go up throughout the economy, which means that the amount of labor associated with certain amounts of production continue to fall. That's not a consistent process. That's not a process that's equal across different sectors, but those are the important factors that determine how much employment is going to be taking place in the sector, is labor demand, essentially. And labor demand is a function of productivity and production. Capital demand has a more complex formula under it. I'm not going to go too much into the detail of it, but REMI calculates a capital stock that's based on basically GDP and population that rises and falls as the size of the economy does. So there tends to be lagged responses to capital stock and investments inside the model. That can matter sometimes, but we're not going to concentrate on that here. So block 2, kind of already talked through it, is the demand side of the labor market interaction, while block 3 is the supply side. So on block 3 you have population. REMI is as much a demographic model as it is an economic model, which does matter in some instances. It's not going to affect us here for energy all that much until we start talking about migration. But as a part of that population model, it produces a labor supply curve, or an implied one, with the labor force. So the population is people by different ages, male or female, different racial and ethnic categories as well. All of those groups have different participation rates, which is reflected in the labor force. And the labor force is going to affect labor supply, which filters throughout the model and affects the amount of employment and the wages that are being paid. Now, I walked through these two things here, and I haven't really talked about energy again for a second. So let's talk about how energy matters to block 2 and block 3. In block 2, energy is influential in capital demand because energy is a type of a factor of production in REMI. It's kind of treated as a type of capital, so there's substitution there. So different energy prices can have a slight substitutory effect between factors of production in like the Cobb-Douglas sense. And it also can affect productivity depending on how you think about it. But block 2 isn't really where it lives. Block 3, there isn't necessarily a strong effect to energy as well, but there is one linkage in here I want to emphasize because I think it actually is kind of important. Population, if you follow my little mouse thing, goes over from the right of it, then up and then over, and it gets lost in this spider web. But if you kind of glance through it, population is actually linked to consumption in the model. which may seem odd, but it actually does make sense because demographics influence what an economy needs to and wants to produce. The standard example of this is that a young state, like say Utah, which I think is the youngest state of the union, has lower demand for healthcare services on just a per capita basis or a per dollar GDP basis than does Florida or Maine or the Dakotas, which are some of the older states, just because older people tend to consume more healthcare than do younger people overall. So the model adjusts for demographic characteristics, mostly age, that influence consumption patterns by region, but it also adjusts for regionality. REMI understands that people in different parts of the country have different consumption preferences. Think of like somebody living in Michigan as opposed to somebody living in like southern Georgia or Florida. The person in the South is going to need less clothing because there's not as much seasonality down there, so they don't have to buy as much for winter clothes relative to summer clothes as they might otherwise. They can wear the same clothes throughout the year for the most part. Michigan, opposite problem. It's cold. You have to have separate wardrobes for separate seasons. People in the South tend to buy more electricity because they air condition more. They also tend to, not entirely, but tend to have heating systems that are based around heat pumps and electricity because it's more efficient to have those in the South than people in the North who tend to have some sort of thermal heating, whether that's fuel oil or natural gas. So they buy more of those fuels in the North, but they buy less electricity because you don't have to air condition quite as intensely in Saginaw, Michigan as you do in Orlando, Florida. So I bring that up because that kind of nature of consumer preference reflects the reality as it is right now between North and South and East and West by region in the country. That may be something that's going to be changing in the future. I'm getting a little ahead on some of the kind of avenues we're going to talk about inside the model here, but a lot of decarbonization pathways that are proposed, whether that's kind of in terms of a technical analysis or whether that's in terms of the actual policy implementation, electrification focus is a very, very heavy focus of decarbonization policies, whether that's converting thermal heating to electric heating, whether that's electrifying the vehicular fleet, so getting more electric cars and trucks and buses on the road. All that power has to be generated, so the power sector will be affected by all that, but electricity is somewhat special amongst energy types where it can be produced and distributed in a form that is very close to zero carbon, not entirely so, but very close to it, while gasoline, natural gas, and the like, they have to be burned in order to produce energy, and for most cases, capturing the carbon from combustion is impractical. So that's going to mean more electrification if you're going to bring emissions down at some point, which is going to change consumption patterns throughout the economy. I swear I'm almost done with this slide. Okay, and then block 4. Block 4 are the actual markets under which businesses and employers and producers and households who are both consumers and workers come together on various markets. So I'll highlight on the left side are the things that more influence consumer behavior. Migration is a concept that's worth bringing up, and I don't think it gets highlighted enough, even if it is one of the like key dynamic model equations for REMI. Migration shows domestic economic migration amongst other types, but the main one that responds to policy simulations are economic migrants. That is, a young person coming out of school, whether that's high school or college, looking for a good job, a high quality of life, a low cost of living, or at least a high wage relative to cost of living, and making location decisions throughout the United States. So the model accounts for those migration flows between states. People have probably read, and I'm not trying to pick on either the state itself or any people on this call who are from there, but people have probably read that California has lost a lot of domestic migrants in the last couple of years. It's accelerated with the pandemic, but it was a pattern that was going on even before COVID hit. It's a couple different reasons for that, but one of the common ones given, and I think it's backed up in the data, is that housing prices are very, very high there, and they continue to stay high over time, which means that the real wage, again, the wage adjusted for the cost of living in California, has been degraded, which makes the area less attractive to domestic migrants. So people are leaving the state to places where the job opportunities and the wages are similar, or at least they're superior if you adjust for the housing prices you have to bear. Hence, the stories of large movements of population from California to Arizona or California to Texas, California to Colorado, although Colorado has gotten expensive as well, and the like. So the model internalizes that logic. Now, I mostly talked through my example of housing prices in California in terms of just housing prices, but energy prices are another factor in that. If you were to make the cost of living substantially higher or substantially lower in REMI, and there's a few ways you could do that affecting consumer prices. You could affect energy prices, which are very, very heavily regional. Electricity tends to be more expensive kind of in the northeast corner of the United States in New York and New England. Big set of reasons why that is, but it is. Electricity tends to be the cheapest for customers in actually the opposite side in the northwest of the country. The large hydro fleet that is present in the Pacific Northwest tends to make electricity relatively cheap. And then all different parts of the country can be higher or lower than that. There's fun maps you can look at about average retail electricity prices for customers. But if you're to do something in a simulation or do some research that indicates my policy is going to have an effect on electricity prices, natural gas prices, fuel, petroleum prices, the consumer price variables in REMI are going to affect the migration that I talked about a second ago. So the biggest effects to consumer prices in the model is they affect real compensation, so they affect real consumption rates, but then they also affect migration. So they affect consumption in the short term and labor supply in the long term. So that's the household perspective on energy prices and energy markets. It's kind of a part of the housing price if you think of that, where two people looking at two homes in two different states at the same prices, but realizing electricity is twice as expensive in one as in the other, they're going to naturally flow towards the lower price option. Businesses also make the same calculation when they're looking at energy prices in the model. The energy prices that businesses face don't affect consumption though, because businesses don't consume, they don't just spend money. They invest, but they don't spend money just to spend it, they spend it to produce. And it also affects, and it doesn't affect their, it does affect their migration though. And the way businesses migrate isn't quite the same as the way households migrate. So a business isn't like a corporeal person or family that you can follow around. It's a little more dynamic than that. But what happens is if energy prices are made higher or lower in a certain part of the country or nationally, it's going to influence where businesses locate themselves. And by locate themselves, I mean a bunch of things. That could be businesses up and relocating, so they just move shop from one place to the other. This could mean one business goes out of business in one region and is replaced essentially by another. This could not be so much businesses are going away. This could be more where does new investment flow to, where are the new opportunities going to develop. It's all of those things. REMI doesn't distinguish between them, but in the real world, it's all of those things. And those decisions are influenced by, as I said a second ago, they're influenced by the cost of energy. So if you're a big industrial firm that has very large needs for natural gas or very large needs for power, you're going to be relatively sensitive to what those prices are. And if they're influenced in your region, you're going to have businesses scale up or scale down relative to that. And then that some business is going to move either somewhere else in the country or somewhere else in the somewhere else in the world. So that's a long preamble to what I actually wanted to do with most everybody here today, which is walk through just kind of what actual REMI variables. So what I gave you a second ago was mostly intuition. Now I'm actually going to talk through these individual variables and what they do and kind of how they affect things inside the model. And to do that, we're actually going to open up the model itself. So this is not a paid version of it. This is the demo city, suburban, rural, 3-region, 170 sector model that has been on the REMI website for at least a decade, just updated versions of it. Anybody is free to download this and either play along or just play with it. If you have your own model for your own regions, it has all the same interface and features and variables. If you're not a REMI subscriber ever or presently, if you just want to have this either to play with or examine or to test out, kick the tires on, or for educational purposes, it's available on their website. They're very nice to make that be there for you. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into the new regional simulation button, so this big green box, and give the model a moment to pop everything open. So I'm doing this live, so a moment of patience as some things load. And it'll give you these different options for how to access things. Some people like using the model blocks here, so you can pick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just if you know where you're going. You can also do model linkages where you can click on the individual like equations that you're curious about. I actually tend to prefer using what's called the full list here, where it gives you every variable just alphabetized, which is easy to do. As you get to be more an advanced user, you kind of know what the terminology is for different variables. But for now, we'll just kind of start with the list that we have curated here. So the first thing in block 1, exogenous final demand. So what exogenous final demand is the idea that something is consumed or something is demanded of an economy and it needs to be produced. So if I open this up and just show you what goes on in here, exogenous demand is by an industry level. So for instance, if you make a change in a region and you have a bunch of businesses move in, or let's do it this way. Let's say you have a lot of industrial users who've been traditionally using natural gas for heat and process heat, but you're trying to have a program to electrify them, both to maybe bring their costs down, maybe bring emissions down, maybe you're trying to reduce the strain on a natural gas system for peak instances in the winter, et cetera, et cetera. That means you're gonna have more demand for electricity. And you can put more demand for electricity into your model by adding more demand for the utility sector. You can also turn around and reduce the demand for the utility sector because natural gas is another type of utilities in there. So that's one thing you can do, is just change demand for an individual sector and change it for the sectors that matter the most to us, which for the purposes of energy analysis are going to be oil and gas extraction. So there's gas. Mining includes coal. It's about half coal, half other stuff that comes out of the ground, but that includes that. And then utilities, which includes power, gas, and water utilities. This is a 70 sector model. There is a nice feature in the 160 sector model, though, that mining gets broken in half between coal and non-coal, so metallic and non-metallic minerals. And then utilities gets broken into, again, electricity, power, gas. So it gives you a little more control of what sectors are looking at here as a consequence of this. And all you do here is just let's just use our utilities example, and we'll just use our urban counties and use our units. I'll just do nominal. This can change depending on your needs, and I'll do millions. You add it into your editor here, and now you've got the variable popped in to where you can type in or paste in what you need to put into this. I know I said I wasn't going to do a ton of interface things, but I've often found in any sort of analysis of REMI, especially with energy, because you can be dealing with a lot of variables very quickly, is if you are diligent, you can actually go through and add the variables that you have identified that you need in a sequence. And this all here, if you hit Control A or select all, and it doesn't give you it doesn't give it as a right click, but yes, Control A works. So the Control all, the Excel command, works, as does either the right click copy or the Control C. And if you were just to open up any yield random Excel document, sorry that I didn't have it open beforehand. Here we go. And paste, it will put the numbers, so all zeros in this case, and then what kind of data is being put in here. So we're putting in demand for utilities in the urban counties and nominal millions. The thing is though, if we go through and we put these numbers in as 1,000, and I do the same thing as before, I copy that and I paste it, it will actually paste that in for you. So this makes it actually easier to work with the system because you can paste in data from external sources in any sort of spreadsheet format. Excel's typical, but anything else that you're using like that. But you can add more than one variable in a sequence. So let's say whatever I was doing is going to decrease gas demand. So if I add that to the editor, now it's stacked these on top of each other. If I copy paste it, and I put it back into Excel again, now they're stacked on top of each other. So you can link data from other models or other research or data that's being provided by a client or by a customer, whatever it might be. You can link it to the kind of structure of the REMI inputs, and all you have to need to do at the end is, if I just take this and do, you know, that times -1, so we're equal but opposite change. All I got to do now is just paste that in, and now I have both sets of numbers in there, and it's quote unquote perfect because the computer's not going to make a mistake in the copy paste, and then it's also much easier to deal with than typing everything in manually. A lot of REMI users are probably familiar with this, but I wanted to show this little interface trick to everybody while we're in here. And this also brings up another important point I wanted to make about energy analysis, though this really is typical with almost any type of analysis with this model. That being kind of the old-fashioned, you know, Econ 101 lesson about there not being free lunches. From the perspective of a regional economy, whenever there's a dollar appearing in it, it has to either come from somewhere else in that regional economy, or it has to be coming from outside. So there are instances where money can come from outside. If you were doing a project about a new factory in a kind of a rural county in Minnesota that's getting like a big manufacturing plant being built there, kind of tucked away quietly away from the big cities, all the money that's coming from the outside investor, whether that's, you know, American, European, Asian, whatever it is, all that money is, from the perspective of that little county, basically free. It's not money or not GDP the county would have had otherwise. So in those cases, you don't really need to have like a corresponding set of inputs and outputs, or inputs to the model that are both positive and negative. But in two types of policy analysis, one of which is fiscal policy and the other of which is energy, usually you need to have a set of inputs where if something is spent, something needs to be constricted at the same time. The idea in fiscal policy being, if taxes are raised in order to encourage spending, well, you need to reflect the drag on an economy of the higher taxes versus the benefits provided by the higher spending. When you're doing in the energy sector, it's kind of a household budget or bill concept where if somebody is spending more on electricity, they might be spending less on something else, and then those two numbers might not line up, so you need to have some sort of buffer or some sort of balance with another set of variables, which we'll talk about in a second. But that high level is exogenous demand, that interface trick about the Excel interface or interfacing with Excel, and then the equal but opposite constraint that is important when you're talking about energy analysis. So that's the just demand for some type of production. But another big component of energy analysis, and this is true when you're doing macro, national level stuff, this is true when you're doing small, kind of localized projects, is the investments being made and what they mean for an economy. So as probably most of us have noticed, of late, President Biden signed the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And one of the big arguments for it, besides the value of the infrastructure and the state of good repair that needs to be maintained, et cetera, is that this is a stimulative effect for the related industries in the United States. So construction, manufacturing, they're going to be providing the expertise, equipment, materials, supplies, and the like that go into actually building and maintaining all this infrastructure. This is the kind of Marshall Plan argument. This is the interstate highway argument from the 1950s, if you're going back to that. That's all true. It needs to be offset by the fiscal cost, but it is all true. But at the local level, if you're, again, building a transmission line somewhere in rural America where there's otherwise not going to be this investment, that's a big economic stimulus. And that can be reflected in the model with these two variable sets that I'm going to show you in a second. So inside the variable list, there's a variable called industry sales. This one right here. And what industry sales does is very similar to demand, but instead of demand where it says, hey, I need this produced and I want to consume it here, demand doesn't care where the production takes place. If you're that small county in Minnesota and you're demanding a bunch of really, really specialized production equipment in semiconductors, in all likelihood, the demand says that's going to come from somewhere else, whether it's even in the United States or somewhere else in the country. While the industry sales variable is the opposite of that, where it says, I know that this is getting built and coming from here. So the economic impact needs to be concentrated on here. This is most typically used for investment side kind of projects. So you're constructing something or you're building the materials in the manufacturing sector that are necessary to put together a power plant or a transmission line or upgrades to charging infrastructure or whatever else it might be. The most important variable here is construction. But notice that I didn't say just the general industry sales sector. You can use these if you want, but the model actually does have available in it. Again, most people don't know this, but REMI has 23, 70, or 160 sectors at the dynamic level, but it actually has static variables for industry sales up to about 360 sectors, if I remember correctly in the counting, which is pretty close to the in-plan level. So it has in-plan detail with in-plan variables. It just doesn't have in-plan detail with non-in-plan variables. So going through the list here is now instead of having just 70, I have over 300. And there's a lot more detail for the individual sectors in here. So we have within the mining sector, coal, nickel, iron, stone, drilling, other support. Within the utility sectors, we have power, gas, and water. And then in the construction sector, which is the other really important one here, is you have this selection here, forget exactly how many it is, but towards the bottom we can see we have specific construction sectors related to transportation, highways, and streets. So that would be useful on the infrastructure side, like the traditional surface roads and bridges stuff. But two above that, we have power and communication structures. So the model has a concept in it of what the spending on building power and communication structures or maintaining them might look like relative to a more general construction sector, which would be very heavily concentrated in like residential and commercial buildings. And building a power plant has a different set of needs and inputs than would just a house. This does not have to be taken as absolutely final. If you have more detailed inputs on a sector, you can build custom industries, which I have seen done semi-frequently. But I wanted to point out to everybody, if you're doing just a sales, you're just somebody's building something and it's a $500 million project, it takes place over 5 years, it's in my region, et cetera, et cetera. If it falls into one of these things much better than it does just the general construction sector, then you can actually allocate those expenditures out into these, which hopefully makes it a little bit easier to reflect in detail what you're looking at. Below all this is like the 5-digit NAICS for manufacturing. These rarely get used just because they're so kind of bespoke to individual sectors, but if you do need them for some reason at some point, they are also available to you down the list there. Back to our list, detailed farm output. In this same list at the bottom, there's a specific variable called detailed farm output you can search for, but just at the bottom of this list that happens to have it. There are also detailed agricultural sectors. So oilseed, grain, vegetables, fruit, et cetera, et cetera. I bring this one up because it is important because a lot of energy related stuff intersects with agriculture, and specifically with biofuels, ethanol, biodiesel, which is soy-based, sugar ethanol, et cetera, et cetera. So whatever you're doing has some sort of influence on the farming sector, it's best to reflect it using these variables for the particular sector we're looking at here. And I bring this up because the farm sector in REMI is completely exogenous. It does not react to anything that you do in the general economy. So if something that you're doing is going to have an effect that's strong and known and regional on the farm sector, like building an ethanol plant and therefore increasing corn production somewhere, or expanding the biodiesel sector and therefore expanding oilseed production, it needs to be reflected down in these variables. The farm sector has no responses. It's completely exogenous to the model structure. So if anything you do in the energy sector has intersections with ag, you need to be careful and start thinking about manually changing those things because it won't automatically on its own. So that's the output side. So these are all basically either production or demand changes that are just exogenously assumed because of, again, a certain energy project or a certain policy or whatever else it might be. Block 2, exogenous industry employment. type that in. You can also do the production changes as an employment concept if you don't know like specific investment numbers. I see this often as well, where somebody might be told, well, we're going to have 1,000 workers there for 2 years on average working on this. We're not going to disclose what we spend, but I'll just say 500. But we will tell you that we'll have those 500 workers going for 2 years, which you can do here and reflect that through direct employment as well. So you can directly add or subtract jobs from the model. That's sometimes useful with energy analysis, particularly when you're looking at individual projects. Block 3, non-pecuniary amenity. So this one is an interesting one, another one that doesn't get used necessarily a ton, but I think it's one of the neater parts of the model. You can actually change quality of life in the model in a monetary sense, assuming you can monetize whatever that is. I'll just set this up and we'll look at it together. Based on some sort of change in, again, quality of life in a region. And this can be numerous different things. So anything that people value that doesn't necessarily, or doesn't pay them directly any more money is part of this. And this can be all the stuff you might imagine. This can be climate factors. So, you know, it's warm in the south, but it's also really hot in the summer. People have different preferences, but, you know, certain climates can be appealing to certain people. There's also geographical features. Some people like outdoorsy things, some people like beaches. Traffic, commute times is another important one there. Being stuck in traffic for an extra hour every day, or having the risk of it in a big congested city, which there are all across the United States, you know, that's just one of the costs that comes with living in, again, not to pick on anyone, but Dallas or Atlanta or Boston or Washington or Chicago or LA or anywhere else like that. But the thing is, being stuck in traffic extra in a big city, or even in a small area, depending on circumstances, doesn't really make you get paid less or more. Yeah, a little bit of gas expenditure, but for the most part, it's just annoyance. It's lost time. So the value of time is also possible as an amenity factor. And then the other big one that gets used a lot is air quality. So anything that's being done in the energy sector usually has an air quality implication to it. I know most energy stuff nowadays tends to focus pretty tightly on climate, but there are still some studies that are done out there that look at traditional measures of air quality. So this can be, you know, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, ozone at ground level, particulate matter, stuff like that, that usually comes out of smokestacks and tailpipes and occasionally other industrial processes. These all have some sort of influence on regional quality of life, long-term health outcomes. They're regulated by the EPA and state agencies for that reason. And if you can make a case that whatever policy you're doing, whether you're intentionally concentrating on these various pollutants or whether it just happens to come along with a climate policy, a lot of climate policies that try to reduce CO2 will also reduce tailpipe emissions because of electrification of vehicles, or the greening, the increasing share of renewables in the power sector. So as gas and coal plants are retired, their pollutants go away. As wind and solar come on, they don't have corresponding pollutants. If you have those idea what those things are, oftentimes as a kind of physical quantity, so kilograms or whatever it might be, you can monetize these. The Transite model, which the demo version of that is also available on the REMI website, has a few just as defaults, and you can look up what some reasonable parameters are for the social costs of these various compounds. Some of them, like nitrous oxide, are like thousands of dollars a metric ton because it doesn't take a lot of them to do much damage, as opposed to social cost of carbon, which is, depending on who you ask, anywhere between $50 and $100 a ton. So that amenity variable, when you put it into the model, what it actually affects directly is population. So people don't just blindly follow the labor market and cost of living in the migration equation. The migration equation does not work perfectly on predicting people's locations. Florida tends to have more population historically than its labor market dictates. The reason for it is probably that very easy beaches and sunshine quality of life adjustment. So the model already understands that certain areas are over or underpopulated relative to labor market quality. Another area that tends to be overpopulated relative to its kind of weak labor market usually is Utah. And that's not climate related typically, that's more social kind of culturally related, where obviously Utah has a very heavy presence of the LDS Church. A lot of people there have large, close-knit families, so they want to stay there. So they're willing to tolerate the cruddy labor market in order to enjoy that benefit, that amenity of the area, as opposed to picking up and going to, say, Texas or Tennessee or something, where job opportunity for a young person may be a little bit stronger. So all these different factors are wrapped up in the amenity variable. But you can adjust them slightly on the margin if you think whatever you're doing has a substantial quality of life benefit to it by just adding amenity to an area. And all it is just adding in this. Give this a second to load. Oh, there we go. And then you can just add in a certain quantity. It has to be $1. But if you, again, can monetize in a reasonable fashion whatever it is you're doing, you can include the amenity benefits of whatever thing you're doing in a simulation. All right, block 4. Promise I'll stop droning on here in a moment because we're very kind of getting close to the end, but I think this has been informative and hopefully helpful to people. Block 4, compensation, prices, and costs. This is more the price side of the model when it comes to dealing with energy markets. And before we get into that, though, I want to talk about the 2 things I have underlined here because there really are 2 different concepts here. When it comes to the energy market, in a changing energy consumption, there's 2 ways it can happen. And this is just kind of standard 101 quantity of demanded versus the shape of the demand curve stuff. When somebody changes their consumption of energy, it could be because they're responding to a price change. So prices went up, therefore people buy less. Or it could be because there's a preference change. And preference is in the very broadest sense. It could be because they, bought an electric heater and they're retiring their gas heater. So they're going to be buying more electricity and less gas. That's not because prices changed, though, by themselves. That's because a preference changed because the type of furnace a person had in their house is different. And so distinguishing between the 2 of those is very, 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 very important when you're trying to reflect price or consumption changes in the model, because otherwise they're going to be reflected long because they have different effects when you actually cycle through. So consumer prices, I'll start there. This is what you do on the household side when you're doing these simulations, when you're looking for the residential impacts. And I'll note real quick is that the variable for the residential impact on price and the variables for the commercial and industrial are actually separate from one another. So you might have to make different sets of inputs in order to reflect the whole set of customer segments. But in consumer prices, there are 4 types of energy directly. Let me see if I can find them quickly. So there's motor vehicle fuels, lubricants, and fluids, which is, as you might imagine, is mostly gasoline, a bit of diesel. There's fuel, oil, and other fuels. So these are petroleum products that are typically used for stationary consumption, mostly heating and some cooking, as opposed to mobile, like the motors. And then down here, there's electricity, and then there's natural gas. And what these are used for, whether it's electricity for lighting or heating or anything else, same thing on gas, actually, for that matter. Some people, most gas is used for heating, but there's like natural gas stoves out there for cooking. There's natural gas laundry machines out there or dryers for washing clothes. So whatever it is, this is where you reflect it. And notice that I'm saying here is this is a consumer price. So this would be a simulation where just use electricity, where what you're really doing is changing the price, like literally the amount that each unit of electricity costs the customer goes up. I typically do this as a percent because it's just easy to manipulate mathematically in Excel and friends. This would be like, say, electricity prices will go up 10% or go down 10%. So this would be, once you get into the editor, a -10 or a +10%. You don't put 0.1, you put 10, and then the model interprets that correctly. This could be because of some change in electricity markets. This could be some climate policy, whatever it might be. That's how you reflect prices. The same variable set for the business side is present in fuel. It's just the term REMI uses for it. It doesn't mean fuel in the literal sense, like a can of gas. It just means energy inputs. You can pick the sectors you want to use. You can use each individual sector however you want. You can also hierarchy it down to all these different, 2-digit NAICS in this case. You can also aggregate it in various ways. Industrial commercial is a good way to, a lot of times, to hierarchy that, to just make it simple. There we go. So yeah, just industrial, commercial. REMI has 3 fuel types for these businesses: electricity, natural gas, and what it calls residual, which is really just everything else that is not electricity and gas. It's like 99% petroleum products. There's a little bit of wood biofuels in there, but it's mostly petroleum products. So that's where, say, gasoline and the like would go. So let's just do industrial, residual, and we'll do our urban counties. And then we can do the same thing as we did a second ago, where we could put in a percentage increase in the price, or if we know what the cost impact is going to be, we can quickly put those numbers in as dollars. So that's how you affect the price of energy. And what this is going to do is, for consumers, it's going to affect their real incomes, and it's going to affect their migration preferences, like we talked about earlier on the spider web diagram. And then the same thing on the business side, it's going to affect their location decisions through their competitiveness throughout the rest of the economy. Now, that is a change in price, but changing preferences is different. This is where you use instead the variable for consumer spending, where it gives you all the same commodities. So again, those 4 for fuel oil, motor vehicle, electric, and natural gas, and you can change that spending over there, and that's going to affect whatever amount of spending is going on into that. I bring this up though, because this last part up here, this last bullet, consumption reallocation, because households typically have a constrained budget, where if they're spending more or less on their utility bills, they have less or more money available to spend on other things. So there's a variable in the model where you can kind of buffer that balance, called consumption reallocation. Come up here in a second, where you basically say, which is, silly example here in Excel, but say a family has to spend $100 more on electricity, but they're saving $125 on gasoline or natural gas or whatever. This would imply that this family is actually making $25. So if we add it up like that, that $25, that balance needs to be reflected in the economy. Oftentimes, I've seen over the years that the biggest effect of some sort of energy policy change on the economy isn't on the necessarily like the energy sector. Oftentimes it's on the consumer economy, because if you're doing something that strongly affects consumer expenditures, or because this issue here, or businesses for that matter. So oftentimes the commercial economy can be more affected by energy policy changes because it links back so quickly to consumer incomes. And if people don't have as much money at the end of the month because they had to pay their utility bill, they may instead decide to go out to eat less or more. That has knock-on effects throughout the economy, et cetera, et cetera. So this consumption reallocation variable is how you actually go through and allocate that $25 to get to where we want to be. I'll skip that. One other thing I wanted to bring up, I just like showing this map because it's pretty. I'll also control L it, and hopefully the screen will catch up here in a second. So this map here shows the geography of the power sector across the United States and North America, for that matter, Mexico and Canada included. This is how we have it represented in our model, Plexos, which there's a few little places here and there where you could like make a case that you could break up or combine things slightly differently than the way it's done. But by and large, this is roughly how the system is laid out. For those of you who've done a lot of energy or electricity stuff or work in the utility space, this is, very basic stuff, but a lot of people haven't been exposed to this and just don't understand how the electricity network is laid out. So what I'm showing here is the power sector in the United States, the electricity sector, is set up along a series of service territories or regions. There's a couple different terms for them, or zones, that don't reflect necessarily political borders. They reflect much more geographic barriers, and they reflect kind of the history of how the power network got set up like a century ago, where like Edison and Westinghouse are competing for different cities and different states and stuff like that. And the endowment of that from the past to the present, and the realities of like the physical layout of the grid, the physical layout of the North American continent, have influenced the shape of our power system. And what I'm kind of winding up to tell everybody here is the geography of the power system influences how your region's going to react to different stimuli in the electricity sector, whether this is a renewable portfolio standard, whether this is more load coming online for electrification, it doesn't really matter. There's a bunch of things it could be, cap and trade, carbon tax, all sorts of things. But different parts of the country react differently to it because they have different power markets. And which states and regions are correlated with each other because they're in parts of the same region with each other is kind of random. There's a couple states out there like Florida and New York that are relatively isolated from everyone else, but even they have interconnections to their neighbors. But I'm going to pick on our friend Illinois and just let you know that, well, if Illinois, you have some sort of power market thing, most of the downstate is in MISO. MISO is that pink area that stretches from the Canadian prairies to New Orleans in the Gulf of Mexico down the center of the North American continent. So what goes on in MISO has a much higher correlation with itself than it would with other parts of the country. But Illinois' major population and centers are, of course, in the northern part of the state around the Chicago metro area. And Chicago is in what's a system called PJM, which originally stood for Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, but expanded west over time. So Chicago's in the same power market with Philly, Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, all the big Ohio cities, while the relatively close neighbors to Chicago, so Springfield, Des Moines, Minneapolis, Madison, Milwaukee, St. Louis, are actually in a different system. So don't think of the power system in terms of political boundaries, because the political boundaries only matter so much for this. You have to think it in terms of the system realities, because the impact of different policies in different parts of the country are going to have very differently, profoundly so impacts, because all these different regions here have different generator sets. Like the Northwest has a lot of hydro, while there's not a lot of hydro in the eastern part of the country comparatively. There's some, but not as much. MISO and SPP, which cover kind of the central plains, have a ton of wind resources. While most of the eastern states don't have much onshore wind resource, they have a lot of offshore wind resource, so they have a different option there. Southern states tend to have better solar resources, especially in the west. Florida is, of course, sunny, but solar there is actually not incredible. It's good, but it's not incredible because it tends to be humid and the moisture in the air disrupts the sun. That's why Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, like Mountain West, Southern Mountain West, solar tends to be the best. So they all have different tendencies. They all have different geographies, supply sides, electricity sectors, and all the other dimensions I've talked about regionally. I just wanted to show this map specifically to everybody in the power sector, and you can look on the internet and find an equivalent map if you want to that's maybe slightly different than ours, but shows the same ideas. Because when you deal with stuff in the power sector, you kind of have to learn a lot about this geography. I'll skip that. This is just kind of a longer explanation of what I was talking about a second ago. And really quickly, just kind of rail through a couple inputs that we use. This is meant to kind of cap things off. When we run stuff in Plexos, our power sector model, we're usually going to have 5 sets of inputs that are put into our modeling results. So we're going to have investments. So this is going to be construction for wind, solar, gas, particularly even potentially coal with carbon capture and nuclear plants. So we handle the supply side with the modeling outputs based on what capacity is getting built. We also do the generation, so how much plants are running or not running, which influences demand for coal, natural gas, fuel oil, and the wind PTC. We have CO2 emissions. We also have air quality emissions, which affect the amenity that I talked about a second ago. And then we also have retail prices. So that's going to affect the residential, commercial, industrial costs of electricity based on an output of our power sector.